I would like to invite all of you to welcome all of you here to this place. Sorry about that. To this place where I work on a very real and daily basis. This place is a committee room called the Aboriginal Peoples Committee Room. I invite you to admire the native arts on the walls. It is also I would say, probably our finest and most modern committee room, in that it is a completely self-contained entity with the round table styling of the seats. In addition to that, its own washrooms right inside, and its own coat racks and so on and so forth. So it is one of the more difficult rooms to get when you try to book rooms, because it is so in demand. As I look around, I see very, very familiar faces, and some faces that I love very much and have had very strong and deep attachments to for a long time. I would like to say to you that the objective of tonight, as you know, is a round table and a lecture, featuring a lecture by one of, I believe, Canada's most remarkable human beings, an exceptional scholar in every way, and is extremely accomplished. He is one of the few people that I know who actually got a bachelor's, a master's, and a Ph.D. from the University of Toronto. I know many people who have got a BA at that university, but not the other two, or got one of the other two and not the first. But it is really, it gives me a pride, because Toronto is my city, after all. And so it makes me feel good that one of Toronto's own has been able to attain that, to my mind, fantastic achievement in the field of scholarship and study. And for those of you who may not know, study is a serious matter, and it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of dedication if you want to do it properly. So we begin by having a Class A scholar on our hands. So let me just continue. Donald Dutton, I've known him for many years. I consider him a friend, and his dear wife is sitting right there, so you can see her. So maybe you should wave so that people know you're keeping an eye on your husband. And he currently is a professor at the University of British Columbia. And in my view, he is Canada's preeminent scholar in the field of domestic violence. So his topic tonight will be, quote, an empirical approach to innovations in intimate partner violence policy. It is very important that you know, and that we begin to talk more about the fact that all the literature and all the research in family violence and domestic violence shows symmetry and reciprocity. In other words, men and women commit violence against each other roughly, equally, right, symmetrical, and with same amount of reciprocity. But yet, the term violence against women has prospered for reasons that are not scholarly, but have more to do with ideology. And for a large part of my career, I have fought that radical feminist ideology, which has had a terrible role, I think, in suppressing serious research and serious study, but in other words, creating the illusion that all violence is men's. In other words, women are all good and beautiful and always truth tellers, but those men, they are, maybe a little bit morally inferior to women, and perhaps even morally defective by nature. And I have a quote somewhere in here by one of the ultra-feminists, and I have it. I won't read it to you directly, but it says something to the effect that to secure a good, healthy female future, the number of males in the population would have to be reduced to 10%. I mean, it's laughable. However, some people take that seriously. I don't. I think it's a nasty statement, and I think it's a vicious statement. But in any event, I think that we will follow this by presentations on Dr. Dutton's remarks, And I'm not too sure if I shall introduce the discussants right now. I'll do it afterwards. But I would like to ask my friend, your husband, our guest, Dr. Donald Dutton, to come and take the podium. Now, is it good enough for you?
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? So many mics here, I'm not sure which is which. First of all, I would obviously like to thank Senator Cools for making this happen. Some of you, I understand, are researchers, so you know how serendipitous it is when a person in a position of political power actually writes to you and asks to read research and, you know, has the intellectual curiosity to follow through on the research. Doesn't happen that often, and it's always great when it does. I also like to thank all of you for showing up today. I understand a lot of you have already put in a 9-to-5 job, and it's after hours is a very long day. I'm probably going to go an hour and some, 20 minutes or a half or so, and
we have lots of wine.
Lots of wine, that's good, okay. Also, a little bit of what I understand that some of what I'm going to say you already know, because I know there's a lot of people here familiar with domestic violence field, so this might be old hat to some of you, and some of it might be brand new. I want to just sort of start out. I've got a sort of picture up here by the New York artist George Tooker. It's one view of gender relations, one I hope we can get away from, but one that perhaps has driven some of the things that drive us in domestic violence. And here's a very recent high-profile case. Ray Rice, National Football League running back with the Baltimore Ravens, who punched his fiancée and knocked her out. He was fired by the team. His fiancée actually wanted to marry him the month after this happened, but the team fired him. And there was a sort of media frenzy about it, talking about victimhood of women and why didn't the NFL act sooner. I want to take this as sort of a jumping off point to explore some of the stereotypes about domestic violence perpetrators. And I'm going to give you a series of three themes that run through a number of high-profile cases in the last period of time, all of which are stereotypic. And I'm guessing you can probably get all three of them. And this is a little device for my college undergraduate classes. They get 2 out of 3 all the time, and they're starting to get the third one. So here's domestic violence 2009. This is Chris Brown, who was charged in March 2009, later convicted of domestic assault on his girlfriend Rihanna. Has had subsequent temper problems, but not with her, perhaps because she has separated from him. So that's Chris Brown, 2009. And Oprah, by the way, on talking about Chris Brown, said if he hits you once, he will hit you again. So there's one of these questions about the recurrence of domestic violence. If it happens once, does that mean it's doomed to happen a second time? Back to 2003, we have Bobby Brown, verbally abusive, jealous, and cocaine addicted. He was married to Whitney Houston. He was arrested for misdemeanor battery on her, as well as drug possession, driving under the influence, and resisting arrest. Back a little bit further, we have Jim Brown. Are you starting to pick up a certain theme here in terms of stereotyping? Former NFL running back and movie star, was arrested and charged with wife assault in 1998. Actually, he didn't assault his wife, but he did smash their car. I was actually on the Larry King show talking about this case. He refused treatment, did jail time for smashing the car. And then 1988, now we're back to the godfather of soul, James Brown. I want to say it gives me great pleasure to bring the godfather of soul to the Senate. I've been wanting to do that all my life. Anyway, he also assaulted his wife, but then grabbed a shotgun and led police on a half-hour car chase across state lines and did 15 months, paroled in 1991. Now, the two obvious, I think, stereotypic aspects, if we say what are the characteristics of all people who commit spouse assault, is they're obviously not all named Brown, and they're obviously not all African American. And in fact, African American rates, once you correct for all the social factors, are not really appreciably different than white rates. And college students get those two right away, and they're now starting to get the third one, which is all spouse assaulters are not male either. okay? But these are sort of perpetrator stereotypes, partially media-driven, come from other sources as well. We can talk about that. By the way, here's my stereotype corrective. Ray Brown, the famous jazz bassist, married to Ella Fitzgerald, played with Dizzy Gillespie. I know I'm dating myself here. No domestic violence. I put him in here to break the stereotype. Here's an African-American man named Brown, and no problem at all. So once we start to get some counterexamples, we can get rid of these stereotypes. Speaking of stereotypes, Francis Bacon came up with this great quote in the New Organum back in 1620. A lot of social psychologists have made their careers just testing this particular statement, that the human understanding, when it's adopted an opinion, draws all things else to support and agree with it, and though there might be a greater number and weight of instances to be found on the other side, yet these it either neglects and despises, or else by some distinction sets aside and rejects, in order that by this great and pernicious predetermination, the authority of its former conclusion may remain inviolate. I submit to you that perfectly states our thinking in domestic violence. If you Google, whoops, sorry, just jumped ahead there. Let's go previous, okay. Previous to that too. This is my other sort of favorite philosopher and forensic psychologist. There's 3 forensic psychologists here now. Sherlock Holmes. It's a capital mistake, he said, to theorize before one has the data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts and to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. That photo, by the way, which we'll come back to, of the woman cowering and the man with the belt, is if you Google images of domestic violence, that's what you get. So here's a book where I summarize some of these thoughts that I wrote. Actually, I'd written a book called Domestic Assault of Women. I was reviewing the research since the second edition of Domestic Assault of Women, which was 1995, and decided I had to rename the book because the research was really pointing in a different direction. This is one of our columnists in Vancouver, Daphne Bramham, a column she wrote about domestic violence, not to pick on her, although I have written to her on several occasions asking her to get things factually correct, and she has not responded. But I know you can't read that, but here's the sort of synopsis of what it says. And half of all women in British Columbia have been either physically or sexually assaulted. 60% of women in shelters refuse to report abuse to police. Only 8% of domestic violence victims are men. And these men are either elderly or disabled. Okay. And then she mixes these stats together with 3 horrific cases. Ravinder Bangu, a woman who was hacked to death by her husband in Surrey, BC. Rumana Manzoor, who was a UBC scholar who was blinded by her husband in Bangladesh, and Katrapa Damon, who was stabbed to death by her husband in June of 2011. So you mix the horrific cases together with these statistics saying half of all women are going to be assaulted, and you create some fear. I'm going to give you, by the way, some counter cases of violence against men at the end of this, just to kind of balance it out a little bit. BC Lions, of course, for the last several years have helped publicize a Stop Violence Against Women campaign. And obviously this leads to the question of whether all IPV, intimate partner violence, is violence towards women. Pop psychology, we've got Oprah, well, not anymore, but she was on for a long time. And we have this notion, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Totally different. We're totally different, wired differently. How can we both call ourselves human? In fact, we're so different. IPV is usually characterized as male perpetrated with a female victim, and there is a suggestion, I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, they're starting to drop this now, but there was a suggestion from functionalist sociology that it was normative and accepted. That was the reason that was given for why there was such lousy police intervention, was that it was normative. So how frequently does it happen? So for example, for 100,000 couples, how many would we get this kind of horrific violence where he's, unilaterally using severe violence, using a weapon against a woman, a nonviolent woman who's clearly terrified. And here we see a spate of books that have come out, Getting Away with Murder, Before It's Too Late, War on Women. There's a real war metaphor that runs through this. At the end of the day, the end of the lecture tonight, in fact, I'm going to ask you if really a war metaphor is the best way to go in setting social policy. Violence against women, the war on women, etc. And of course, in Canada, we've got this particularly high-profile case, Life with Billy. Those of you who don't know, Billy Stafford was a chronic, unremitting bully, alcoholic, and wife-beater in Nova Scotia, whose wife killed him, and the reaction in the town was, about time. I mean, this was a guy that nobody wanted to be living much longer, and this became kind of a prototype for battered woman's self-defense. Billy became a stereotype for domestic violence. Now, there are guys like Billy out there. The question is, how many? I've done several expert witness cases against guys like Billy, or working on behalf of a woman who's killed somebody like Billy. So it starts back. I, by the way, have been around a long time. I was here, you can date yourself with this one, when Margaret Mitchell in the House of Commons started talking about wife assault, and some honorable members of the Liberal Party were seen to be laughing. It was thought to be that they were laughing at her comments. They later said no, they were not paying attention and laughing at something else. But that triggered a huge reaction. That was sometime in the 1970s. Were you hear that? Okay.
And the joke was that they were laughing at what she said. She came on, she began by saying, I have a really upbeat motion about beat up women. And that's what they were laughing at, her construction. And that became a national crisis, as it was reported that they were laughing at the concept that women should not be beaten. Right. It is one of those funny things.
Right. So anyway, I had testified before a standing committee just before that happened. And at that point was just sort of trying to raise awareness about domestic violence as an issue, because prior to that, I mean, there's a whole history of our societal awareness of family violence that goes back throughout the whole of the 20th century. And I won't bore you with it, but one quick anecdote is that Teddy Roosevelt wanted whipping post legislation for wife assaulters. And it was voted on in 3 countries, Canada, the U.S., and Britain, and turned down as cruel and unusual punishment everywhere except in 2 U.S. states where it was used disproportionately against African Americans, just so you get some idea what happens with some of the more severe aspects of social policy to deal with domestic violence. So that was obviously early 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt was trying to do that. So there's a focus here that starts back in the 70s and 80s that came from functional sociology. The argument was that domestic violence is male violence that is committed in order to promote and maintain and sustain a patriarchy. So it has a political basis, and it's a form of normal control, and the normal acceptance was one of the things that was pushed. And Michelle Bograd phrased it pretty well this way, from the point of view of this particular school of thinking. All feminist researchers address a primary question: why do men beat their wives? Why men in general use physical force against their partners, and what functions this serves for a given society. So in functionalist sociology, things sustain themselves because they serve some kind of social function, and the function here was to sustain patriarchy. And Dobash put it this way: men who assault their wives are actually living up to cultural prescriptions cherished in Western society: aggressiveness, male dominance, and female subordination, and they're using physical force as a means to enforce that dominance. So this was the origin of the thinking. And then, of course, Catherine McKinnon wrote probably the most detailed exegesis of this particular line of thought. She wrote the book Towards a Feminist Theory of State, and the key line here being that sexuality is to feminism as work is to Marxism, early on in the book. women become the new proletariat, men are the new bourgeoisie. And therefore, every act of intimate partner violence against a woman is violence against women, i.e., it's plural, it's a political act. So this is where some of these things started, and Stats Canada picked up on that issue with gender-based violence. And of course, who believes this? Well, a lot of people believe it, or believe the sort of sequels of this line of thought, but certainly in the criminal justice system, a lot of people believe it. Provincial ministries, a lot of people believe it. Child custody assessors have been taught to think this way. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Police are taught to believe it. They're given a heuristic for domestic violence, which is that it's going to be largely a male perpetrator. Now, I'll just raise the question, not try to answer it yet, but is every act of intimate partner violence where a woman is a victim, is it violence against women in the plural sense? You could draw a comparison here with hate crimes against gays, where the legal test is whether it was perpetrated because the recipient was gay, as opposed to just being an assault that happened and coincidentally the recipient was gay. The questions about motivation, that the answers people give for why they commit domestic violence, both men and women, are quite similar, but they don't have anything really to do with power relations. They have to do with a lot of psychological frustration. And we can come back and look at that, this question of whether or not this is really something that is shaped by a socio-political context. There's some shaping for sure, but probably not the whole thing. Now, one question, whether or not it's acceptable, because Dobash and Dobash said, yes, it's normative, it's culturally acceptable, that's why the police don't intervene. Is there a cultural prescription? Surprisingly enough, there wasn't really a good answer to this from the research for a long period of time until 2001. And then there's a study that Simon et al. Did with a nationally representative sample in the U.S., 5,232, a random digit dialed sample, asking these questions. Under what circumstances, if any, is it okay for a man to hit his wife or girlfriend? How about if she hits him first? How about to keep her in line? And then they asked the same question, reversed. Is it okay for a woman to hit her husband or boyfriend? And the overwhelming result here, like 2% of men think it's okay for a man to hit his wife or girlfriend to keep her in line. 2%, I think you would probably agree, is not normative. I mean, normative, we think of something around the area of 50% or more. My baseline statistic for all these things is 6%, because that's the number of Americans who say they've been abducted by UFOs. So if it's a smaller number than that, I usually say, okay, that's definitely a very small and unusual group that is answering this question. Even when one person is struck by the other, a majority still don't think it's okay to use violence. But certainly this notion of hitting her to keep her in line is clearly not normative. The authors of this study suggested that, in fact, there was more evidence for a norm of chivalry than there was for a norm of wife assault. Incidents, how frequent does it happen? You see all kinds of numbers bandied about. I'm going to just talk a little bit about how best to measure these things. First, they were measured through what are called crime victim surveys. Were you a victim of a crime in the past year? What was it? What happened? The only problem with that is it assumes that whatever happened to you, you defined as a crime. So Murray Straus, who is a sociologist at the University of New Hampshire, came up with something he called the conflict tactics scale, a way to sort of take the crime filter, to lift it off of this kind of problem and to sort of put it into a kind of more normal everyday context. And so that normal everyday context is conflict tactics. So he has this preamble to a self-report scale that he developed. And the preamble just basically says this, we all go through conflict. No matter how well we get along, we run into conflicts from time to time. We have spats or fights. these things happen, and we use different ways to try and solve these things. Which have you used in the past year? Okay, so that's the question, which have you used in the past year? And now we have a very broad definition. It's just something that's used to, it's not even called abuse, at least not on the scale. We might define it that way after, but the scale doesn't call it that. And it doesn't have to be a crime anymore. And so here you see the actual scale, and people are asked, well, which one of these did you use? And it starts out with all these really rational things that we would like to think we all used all the time. And then it gets into verbal abuse down here. And then as you go on, it gets into, at this point, what are considered to be physical abuse items. So the yellow ones start the measure of physical abuse. These things have all been factor analyzed, so we know how they relate to each other. So pushing, grabbing, or shoving, and slapping the other one, these are all kinds of, this is the beginning of this physical abuse scale. And then you get down to the red items. You have what's called the severe physical abuse scale. These are the ones that are most likely to result in injury, where a weapon, in fact, might be used or someone's kicked or beaten up, etc. Now, it turns out when you use this scale, you get reports that are 16 times more frequent than if you have a crime victim filter on the report. Way more domestic violence gets reported using this scale. And then there was a second version that was used and added sexual coercion and injury. I'm going to move along pretty quickly over this because I've got some data I want to talk to you about. So 16 times more sensitive, and the general findings, I can kind of summarize them this way. In fact, I'll show them to you. Here they are. When you use this scale in the general population, you find the overwhelming majority of people, it doesn't matter what demographic category they come out of, okay, by race, by class, whatever. The overwhelming majority of people say no domestic violence. It's somewhere from 83 to 97%. Didn't happen to them. And then, was there any at all? Yes, 14, 17% say yes, there was. And was it severe? Then a much smaller percentage. So the key thing here, a couple of things that are important to note, is that the majority of intimate partner violence that's reported, about 2/3 of it, is of the less severe variety. Okay, it's the pushing, shoving, slapping. Not to say these are good things to do, but better than using a weapon or beating somebody up. The severe IPV over there on the right-hand side, running, from 1 to 7%, is committed by a tiny minority of people in any demographic category, which suggests that demographic factors are not driving domestic violence. So there's this small group that differs somehow from everybody else in their demographic category, and probably differs, I submit, in psychological ways. You can't, in other words, you can't explain it just based on demography. It's not that influenced by social class or race. Canadian General Social Survey, 2004, huge sample. They moved partway away from the crime victim filter. Unfortunately, they still talked about it as perceptions of crime, so it didn't completely get rid of it. Here's what was used. A lot of these items you see are the same as the conflict tactic scale items, specific acts. And what they found in that survey was that 7% of all Canadian women and 6% of all Canadian men reported being abused by a partner at least once in the last 5 years. 5 years. So, that's a pretty large measure, sample of 25,000 people. Denis LaRoche, who works in the government of Quebec, published a nice analysis of a lot of the data in this particular survey and reported some of the things sort of broken down by gender. Threatening with a weapon was equal. Males were more likely to push and grab. Females may be more likely to kick and bite. And then we have this concept, intimate terrorism. This is a concept that you have a subcategory of domestic violence relationships that are particularly a problem because the abuse is happening chronically, it's being repeated. One person's terrorizing the other person, like using threats and intimidation to gather an enormous amount of power over the other partner. And with the Canadian Social Survey, there was a power scale built into it. So it was possible, in other words, to estimate the use of intimate terrorism, which Denny LaRoche did, and found that this repeat severe instrumental violence by a partner was reported by 2.6% of all men in the survey and 4.2% of all women in the survey. And that, of course, is considered to be a particularly egregious form of domestic violence because of the risk of injury. And that's one where obviously we need to get in and intervene as quickly as possible. And then LaRoche also looked at what people did as a result of this, calling police, women more likely to call police, men less likely to seek help. No help from a shelter. We'll come back and talk about that one because that's not really possible. Seeing a psychologist, though, women were more likely to make use of that. Somebody's sort of slightly in front of one of the projector there. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think so. I think it must be. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good. So all these things were kind of first put together by John Archer in a study he did in 2001. He did this huge meta-analytic study. Meta-analytic study, you take all the separate studies that have been done, in this case on gender and intimate partner violence, and you analyze them in such a way that you take into consideration the different sample sizes, etc., and you come up with a generic or composite score across all studies. So it's typically thought to be the kind of gold standard because it avoids problems that might be associated with any one particular study. And so Archer did this for gender and domestic violence and calculated a statistic called D prime. We got rid of t-tests a long time ago in social sciences. You know, they tell you that there's a significant difference between groups, but when you're studying groups of sample size of 65,000, everything's going to be significant. What you want to know is how big a difference is there, and that's what D prime tells you. It tells you the size of the difference between two groups. It's typically reported as a percentage of a standard deviation between the two distributions of the two groups. So it tells you how big. Very useful statistic to know in health statistics, for example. You want to know that brushing your teeth a particular way is good. You want to test 300 studies that have used two different ways of brushing teeth. You want to know what the D prime is, not just that there's a significant difference. So that's what Archer used here, D prime, as a measure of a number of different aspects of domestic violence. So here you see the data, and we're looking at huge numbers here because, you know, he's got hundreds of studies into this composite meta-analytic study. And the bottom line is this: the D prime across studies said that women were slightly more likely to commit intimate partner violence than were men. That's why this is a negative 0.05. Were more likely to be injured, but 1/6 of a standard deviation. So, you know, to translate that into IQ terms, 1/6 of a standard deviation would be about 3 IQ percentage points. It's a small difference, in other words. Okay. And medical treatment, 0.08. So this got published in a major psychological journal, the Psych Bulletin, in the year 2000. And the first sort of major thing that reported across a number of studies the fact that female violence was so prevalent. Here's what it looks like, okay? You see two overlapping distributions with a D prime here of 0.06. So it's not black and white, is what it's saying. You got two slightly different shades of gray here in terms of this particular violence. Now, If that wasn't enough, Sarah Desmarais, Ph.D. from Simon Fraser University, who's now teaching in the U.S., combined data from 750 studies of intimate partner violence incidents, boiled it down to 249 that were methodologically the best and had the most information. 86% of these were done in the U.S. There's sample sizes from 42 to 135,000, and focused primarily on past year rates because those are ones where our memory is a little bit more reliable. Lifetime rates, there's memory issues. And that doesn't show up really too clearly. What this says right here is large population studies, and I don't know why it's not showing up clearly, but anyway, the black bar is the male victimization rate, and the gray bar, which doesn't show up as gray there at all, is the female victimization rate. So in large population studies, the male victimization rate is about 19%, and the female rate about 13%. Now that, by the way, is taken from reports both by men and women. And it actually doesn't change the percentages significantly, depending on who the gender is of who's doing the reporting. So in the large population, men are reporting more victimization. This second one is a smaller sample. Here, there's slightly more victimization by women. It doesn't show up very clearly there. In university or college samples, and I'll show you this one in a minute, men are by far more victimized than women are, especially in Canada. So past year victimization rates, 13% of women report being victimized by intimate partner violence in the past year. 18% of men report it in the past year. And this is now 249 surveys combined together into a meta-analytic study. Hard to know how you could get a stronger result than that in social science. It's about as strong as it gets. Perpetration rates are, of course, the flip side of that. Here, women are reporting higher perpetration rates than men are. And since that's not showing really clearly, what I'll do here is, let me just show you. Here's a summary of the whole thing. Okay, so the male data is reported by males, the female data is reported by females, but what you find is females report less victimization than men do, and females report more perpetration than men do. And interestingly enough, each gender reports more perpetration than the other gender reports victimization. Of course, there's been a lot of sort of theorizing about that. Why are they not identical? The thinking is that people tend to underreport victimization, that there's some shame attached to it. The opposite theory would be people wanting to over-report perpetration, and that doesn't seem likely. Okay, so, and just to compare that, so now we're talking about 249 surveys that show male perpetration is lower than female, and victimization is higher. And Daphne Bramham, who's saying something that I don't think is that unusual in Canadian newspapers, only 8% of men are victims. I mean, even if you look at the Canadian Social Service, social survey, you see that it's clearly much higher than that. And it's not just elderly or disabled. That's just part of the stereotype that men are bigger and stronger, so they should be able to defend themselves. Of course, there's psychological reasons that would inhibit some men from defending themselves. Okay, but I think that's where that comes from. Now, this you can say, well, this study looks a little dated, but I'm going to build on it. This is data from the 1985 U.S. National Survey that Jan Stetz and Murray Straus did. And so it's a large national survey, 5,833 people contacted on the telephone, asked about domestic violence. 922 of them report some, 16%. It's about an average report rate. The report rates are higher with younger populations. That's the one demographic factor that does impact on incidence. And so then we're going to look here at something they did in this particular report that is essential, but it hasn't been done that great a number of times. In other words, what they do is they take all those people who report domestic violence and they break it down into the patterns of violence that happen in a particular family. It's possible for the female to be nonviolent or to just use minor violence or to use severe violence. It's also possible for the male to do any one of those three things. So here they've got that all broken down, and of course they were also interested in cohabiting and married couples. So you see the difference here. But even if we just pick married couples at the bottom, these percentages are not percentages of the whole population who report this. They're percentages of the population who reported domestic violence and how it breaks down into these particular patterns. So for example, down here in the lower left, amongst married couples, 7.5% report males using minor violence, again, that's pushing and shoving, etc., against a nonviolent female, okay? And 18.9% report females using minor violence against a nonviolent male. Now, so you get all these different patterns. And now there's a number of sort of questions this raises, because we think about domestic violence monolithically. You know, there's just one general pattern. It impacts on our policy. It impacts on how we perceive risk in the future, etc. But if all these different patterns are happening, it raises questions about risk, recidivism rates, etc. Which one of these patterns would be most likely to recur? Are there differences? Interestingly enough, there's been very little research done on this, in part because I think of the gender paradigm, which is focused research very narrowly. The most common forms up here, let's just focus on married, just to sort of keep it a little simpler. It's also the largest data set. The most common forms are both minor, followed by female minor against a nonviolent male, followed by both severe. So if you actually take the both severe and both minor, add them together, you've got 38.8% of these couples who report violence saying it happens bilaterally, match for a level of severity, i.e., if the man uses severe violence, the woman uses severe violence. Now, we don't know who started it. We don't know who escalated it. There are some studies on who initiates it. But the largest group, the largest pattern, if you will, is bilateral violence. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, to go back to our severe wife assault example, that would be male severe, female none. So in the married group, 5.7% of people who report domestic violence report that happening. But that would be wife battering. But 9.6% report females using severe violence against nonviolent males. So it's not self-defensive violence that's happening here. So these different patterns cause us to have a sort of more elaborate view of what's going on with domestic violence. And here we just see some of the summaries. So for the female severe, male none, 9.6, and male severe, female none, wife battering, 5.7. And needed medical care, the same statistics. So you can say, yeah, but that was 1985. Things have changed. So here we fast forward to 2007, a study by the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, senior author Whitaker. 11,370 young people between ages of 18 and 28. This is the National Longitudinal Study on Adolescent Health. It's what's called a representative cohort sample. So they've carefully selected these people to represent the peer group or age group that they derive from. 24% now report some intimate partner violence, more frequent with younger people. Of those who report it, half report reciprocal violence again. Now it's like 49.7%. But of the ones who report unilateral violence, 70% of the perpetrators were female. Only 30% were male. So now, in other words, you go from the 1989 study that Straus did to the 2007 study that Whitaker does at Center for Disease Control, you get the same results in terms of patterns of domestic violence. Bilateral, number 1. Predominantly female violent, number 2. Male violent, 3. Here's the other thing I think that is of utmost importance that comes out of the Whitaker Center for Disease Control study. Most female injury resulted from reciprocal intimate partner violence, not from the stereotype of the unilateral male beating her up. It came from reciprocal violence. Now that, if we're really interested in reducing violence towards women, then that suggests that we need to start paying attention to reciprocally violent relationships. If these are the ones that the evidence says is for women that are getting hurt the most, then we need to rethink our policy in some way to take this into consideration. There's what Whitaker et al. Said. Men were more likely to inflict injury than women, and reciprocal intimate partner violence was associated with greater injury than was non-reciprocal intimate partner violence, regardless of the gender of the perpetrators. It didn't matter whether it was the man or the woman in a unilateral role. They weren't causing as much injury as bilateral violence. Okay, so that's 2 studies 20 years apart. But in fact, there's 5 large sample independent surveys that have been done, which are listed up here. So the top one is the one we talked about, Straus, 1989. The second one, Whitaker, National Longitudinal Study, Adolescent Health, 18 to 28. If you're 28, you probably don't think of yourself as an adolescent, but anyway. Second one down. Then there's the National Comorbidity Study, the National Survey of Couples, the National Youth Survey. 5 large sample surveys, independent, done by different people, different times, different populations. They all find the same thing. What do they find? Well, the column on the left, the percentage of people who report intimate partner violence. And, it runs from a low of 15% up to 35%. The cohabiting couples in 1989. But then the next 3 columns tell you how that column's made up. How is it comprised? Is it predominantly male violent? That's the first one. Is it predominantly female violent? I.e., she's using more severe levels of violence than he is. That's the middle one. Or is it bilateral violence? That's the one on the right-hand side. And if you add them up, the most common form, again, is bilateral violence. Now, this is across 5 independent surveys, total sample size of 25,000 people, approximately. Second most common is female violence. That's the middle with 3, in the 25-35 range. Third most common is male violence. I submit, as a social scientist, that those data are pretty compelling and certainly discordant with our policy. Discordant. But I can't imagine how the data could be stronger. To have independent surveys, large sample surveys, and especially some surveys that are focusing on younger people who are going to regenerate this problem unless it's dealt with. That's what we have here with adolescent survey and a youth survey. All saying the same thing time after time after time. And that's this. Now, something's very wrong because when I talk to college students about these data, our most educated people in Canada, their jaws drop, they hit the floor. It's so out of completely discordant with how they think about domestic violence, which goes back maybe not to the rather absurd stereotyping I was showing you at the beginning, but certainly goes back to the stereotyping of just looking at males as assaulters. As far as I know, we've never asked in Canada on a victim survey, did you also perpetrate anything? Or if it was asked, I never saw it reported. Now, why is that? When all these surveys in the U.S. are showing the same thing time after time after time, we won't even ask the question? And we want to base policy on that. Don't get me started. Oh, I already started. Okay. So mutuality is an issue. Here's Deborah Capaldi's study, the Oregon Youth Survey. What's interesting about this is it's a longitudinal study. They were studying youths in Oregon. They started looking at these peer groups when they were in their teens, and they'd go back every couple of years and ask them whole varieties of questions about health and mental health and domestic violence and everything else. And so they were sort of keeping track of these couples longitudinally across time. And some interesting things came out of that, which I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm going to say there also, Lisa Serban and Lynn Magdal have done some longitudinal studies as well. And one of the things that Serban found in the Concordia study done in Montreal was that aggressive girls and aggressive boys would find each other out, what they call assortative mating. And Terry Moffat talked about this also in a study they did in New Zealand, with the Dunedin study. It's another independent source as to why mutuality is a problem, okay? And then finally, there are all these studies that have been done in labs, a couple interaction studies. Neil Jacobson did one at the University of Washington. I consulted on that. He built an experimental apartment, advertised for abusive couples to come in, wired them into sort of polygraphs and said, argue about what you usually argue about. I said, Neil, this is never going to work. It's too artificial. It worked. They got really angry. If you read the scientific papers he wrote, he says in a little footnote, you've got to get a magnifying glass to see, 40% of these women got up to the severe abuse category. We were really surprised by that. Then he went and wrote a book about cobras and pit bulls, 2 male batterers, which he sold on Oprah Winfrey. No mention of the women. Okay, but they're finding mutuality. Gayla Margolin, same thing. Ken Leonard, same thing. Ken Leonard just said, okay, you get these mutually abusive couples. What happens if you throw alcohol into the mix? Well, this negative reciprocity, these conflict traps these people get stuck in, where each one's trying to top the other and each one's trying to be right. And that's more important than anything else, and they're sure the other one's bad-mouthing them, being unjust to them, and that makes them even angrier. You put alcohol into that mix, bad news. Now, statistically, I'm going to say the most common problem, if we wanted to quickly diminish injuries or domestic violence, is to teach people how to get out of a coercion trap without hurting each other. Okay, how to get out of it. I mean, why not? The most common form of domestic violence is bilateral. These people, when they study bilateral violence in labs, there's this negative reciprocity. These coercion traps go on. If they weren't in a lab, it would get worse. Okay, so now the question of these things repeating. With 50 years of research on domestic violence, there's only one study I know of that has ever looked at sort of long-term repetition the way these guys did. And this was Murray Straus, Feld and Straus, 1993. They took the data from the 1985 National Survey in the U.S. and they went back 1986 and re-interviewed 835 of the couples who reported violence in year one to see whether it was recurring. And then they got 560 people who reported no violence in year one and put them into the mix to see what kind of predictive factors they could come up with. So here's one of their tables, and they're focusing here on severe assault by the husband in 1986. So the first predictor they find is that if you're going to predict that severe assault by the husband is going to happen in 1986, here's husband severity in year two. The best predictor is, was he being chronically abusive, severely abusive in 1985? Yeah, I mean, we know that one's in all of our predictive checklists, looking at chronicity of violence, etc. Yeah, these are guys that have been repeatedly violent. They should have been intervened in much sooner. But the ones who did it 3 or more times in 1985, 57% chance that they're going to do it in 1986. So that's one predictor. And that one a lot of people know about. Here's one they don't know so much about. That here we look at the husband's severity in 1985, year one, none, minor, or severe. So let's just take the guys that were using severe violence in 1985. How likely are they to use it in 1986? Well, if they're with a woman that doesn't use severe violence, only 6% use it in 1986. If they're with a woman that used minor violence in 85, 23% are likely to use it in 1986. If they're with a woman who uses severe violence same as they do, 42% use it in 1986. Why is that interesting? Because there is not one single risk prediction instrument in psychology that asks for assessment of both members of the couple. And when I was asked in maybe 2003, I had a group in Chicago wanted me to come down and talk about risk prediction, and finally I said, okay, and I sent them these data, and they canceled the next day. Because in those days, and to a certain extent still today, you just don't look at the woman's behavior. It's blaming the victim. And how do we know that she's the victim? Because it's politically mandated. I mean, all we know from the data here is that there's 2 victims, and they're using severe violence against each other. But we know that when that happens, they're 6 times more likely to keep doing it the next year. Don't we want to know that? You want to intervene? You want to stop it from happening? Why would you not want to know that? Don't get me started. Okay, repetition. Most likely recidivists, both members of a couple use severe violence. The husband only used it once or twice in 85 without knowing what the wife's IPV was. Then his 1986 rate for severe violence was 19%. Okay, now one other, I'll go over this one a little bit more quickly, but one other aspect of the original stereotype of domestic violence is it was always used for control. Power and control. But again, Jan Stetz at Washington State University has done research on this. 1,295 couples using a control scale. Wives reported more frequent control over their husbands and vice versa. Levels of control declined from year one. Right after marriage, they peak right after marriage. This is the good news for those of you who have been married more than 1 year. Up to year 3, which was as far as they did the measurement in this particular study. Okay. Felsen and Outlaw, same thing. Analyzed data from the National Violence Against Women survey. They actually had men in that survey too, although I've often wondered what these guys thought they were answering. We're calling you for a National Violence Against Women survey. Now tell us what's happened to you. They had a controlling behavior scale there, sample of 9,000. Their conclusion, the findings indicate no support for the position that husbands engage in more marital violence because they're controlling. They said control manifests differently by gender. It's highest amongst working class, lower education couples who are recently married. Those were the main predictors. Is female violence self-defense? Well, I mean, we've already looked at a high number of violent acts against nonviolent men from the survey data. When they ask who initiated the violence, the ratings run from 40%, that should be 1999, one too many nines up there, to 74%. That is women saying that they started the violence. Women are more likely to hit back when struck than men are. And there's a number of studies that just ask people why they used intimate partner violence against their partners. And here's one Caldwell et al. Did. Self-defense was ranked 4th. The usual motives are expression of negative emotions, control, toughness, intimidation. And 484 college women asked about perpetration. The motives they gave were anger, retaliation for emotional hurt, and inability to express the self verbally. So there's psychological reasons, in other words, it's not self-defense and it's not really about power. This actually...
That inability, it's just on the previous page, the inability to express
self-verbally.
Self-verbally. I found that a lot when I was in business of assisting people in domestic violence. I found that a lot. Each side of the equality, the woman and the man, but always be said, just frustration,
right.
Struck out, just frustration, that sort of thing. So that's very common, and because so many of these people have never been exposed to the tools of what I call living, negotiating life, then,
right.
in terms of having exchanges with people. And then it really strikes you how lacking for so many people these skills are.
Right. Do we make too much of the male-female difference thing? Well, there's 2 huge meta-analytic studies in psychology that say the resounding answer to that is yes. Here's one that Harry Rice and Carruthers did. Looking at male-female differences in psychological traits. Okay, now we're not talking about stereotypic activities. We're talking about psychological traits like intimacy, empathy, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, emotional stability, conscientiousness. No difference. They're not finding the differences, the stereotypes would lead us to think were there. No differences found for any personality traits. They were dimensional. And distributed pretty commonly. And in fact, they said, in conclusion, there are not really, psychologically, there are not 2 distinct genders. Instead, there's linear gradations of variables associated with sex, all of which are continuous. But you just don't find these huge differences. Janet Hyde wrote an article in the American Psychologist on the gender similarities hypothesis, finding that cognitive, social, psychological, and psychological well-being, the effect size was 0.21. Again, that's a small effect, 1/5 of a standard deviation difference. That would mean in IQ terms a difference of 3 IQ points. It's a very small difference. We seem to be creating larger differences than are there. Why did this happen? Carruthers and Rice said, well, people tend to think categorically. We have easily accessible categories, the kind that Francis Bacon was talking about, and then we keep finding examples to verify the categories that we have, and we disregard the examples that don't fit. And pretty soon those categories rule the roost. Now, any lesbian and gay community, bisexual community, transsexual community have obviously not been well served by the gender paradigm because they don't fit the notion that it's always male violence against a non-violent female. And here's there's several interesting studies done. This one that Guanyat Lee did in Arizona in 1991. 350 lesbians, 78% of them had prior relationships with a man and a woman at different times. And they were asked to report on abuse victimization in each, and they report consistently higher abuse by the female partner. Interesting for 2 reasons. I mean, one is these women are all a sort of common factor in each one of these relationships, the one with the man and with the woman. And also, I mean, the general incidence reports suggest that if you're living in any kind of alternative arrangement, there's more stress on that arrangement, which can contribute to the violence rates all over. But the main point being these communities just not well served. And when I was a therapist in the Assault of Husbands Project, I kept wanting to take gay men into our treatment groups. My other therapist said, no, it'll be too disruptive. And so the result was there's nothing for these guys, just nothing. The injury problem is an interesting one. Only one careful study done on injuries to males, emergency clinic in Philadelphia, where they actually asked males who came in with injuries, how did you get that? Hardly ever done. 12.6% were victims of domestic violence. They reported being kicked, bitten, punched, or choked. In 47% of the cases, 37% reported a weapon being used against them. The authors reported the numbers would have been higher, but they had to stop counting after midnight and screened out the major trauma cases, which get worse as we get later. Also, studies done on psychological consequences. This was a large sample study by Coker. You see practically 14,000 people in this, and they find basically that psychological and physical victimization produce similar effects in both genders: depression, substance use, chronic physical illness, chronic mental illness. So again, it's not just women who are who are disturbed by the impact of domestic violence. Now, child abuse, big issue. I got into a sort of a series of polemic in the literature with this one with Michael Johnson. But there were two books written on custody assessments in 2003, one by Peter Jaffe, one by Lundy Bancroft. And they both basically said this. One, if you're doing custody assessment, you better really scrutinize the male because he's really at risk for being a child abuser, especially if he's abused his wife. And then they said, expect the men to deny this, which I then went on to describe as the witch hunt formula for doing an assessment. Only male domestic violence serious to women and children, and abusive men will be extra litigious, Jaffe said. That claim was based on 2 anecdotal reports, not on any data. By the way, the actual overlap of wife abuse and child abuse is 6%, documented overlap, okay? So custody assessors need to know this. We look at the U.S. National Survey on child maltreatment. Oh, that's not showing up well at all. Okay. These are perpetrators of child fatalities. Anyway, the bottom line is the mother is involved 60% of the time in child fatalities, and the father 42%. And this is, if you want a big sample, almost 750,000 investigations of child abuse. So, if I'm going to be speaking in Seattle in June to the American Association of Family Court Counselors, going back over these data again, just to make sure that, hey, it's an assessment. You assess both parties. That's the thing that's fair and empirically validated. Lynn McDonald, one of the few studies we could find where somebody actually asked women in a shelter about their own use of violence, and she did, and she found women's own violence was an independent predictor of her children's behavior problems. That the children were 2.5 more times more likely to be exposed to maternal intimate partner violence than paternal, and these were women who were in a women's shelter. So we know already that this is a highly select group that's been exposed to a lot of violence. The fact that their own violence was entering in here is really pretty amazing. Okay, we talked about that one. Right, Ed Gondolf did a predictive study on men in treatment groups for domestic violence, focusing, of course, on characteristics of the man that would make him amenable to treatment or not. But again, hidden away in the small print in the footnote, 66% of these men in treatment for wife assault have female partners who report being physically aggressive to the man. And 40% of them, these women said they had initiated the violence. So I just was going to talk to you a little bit about college students as well. This is a Douglas and Straus cross-cultural dating study, 17 countries, 6,900 college students. And let's see if this one shows up. Yeah, that shows up pretty well. So you can pick out some of the Canadian universities up there. And this is reporting the female intimate partner violence rate as a percentage of male. So 100% is equal. Less than 100 is the female violence is less. And over 100, it's more. So we get down to Canada, London, 170.8%. We get down to Canada, Toronto, 143.5. Canada, Winnipeg, 177. Oh, wait a minute. Did I get that right? No, it's only 96.8. And then Canada, Hamilton, I guess that's McMaster, 181.1. Canada, Montreal, 113.3. The same result, in other words. So then, the other question is just this general one about policy. Does the gender paradigm protect women? Some studies have found that some of the more criminal justice-oriented solutions to dealing with domestic violence, like mandatory arrest, or in some cases family court, a family violence court, have not really had their intended impact. In the study that Hotelling and Buzawa did on family court, they went and interviewed women who had come back to court and women who'd never come back to court and found out that there were equal amounts of violence going on in the two groups. And the women who didn't go back to court said, well, it was just such a hassle and it was such overkill the first time that we didn't want to go back to court. So the court didn't really solve the problem. Radha Iyengar, she is an economist at Yale, found there were higher domestic violence death rates in those states that had mandatory arrest policies. And her theory was, again, that women in those states avoided calling the police because they didn't want mandatory arrest. There's all the Sherman and Burke and other studies done on police arrest with very mixed results. Basically Sherman and Burke got a deterrence effect for about 8 months, and then it flip-flopped, and the arrested group did worse. So what made this study interesting was that they'd actually had police clear the call randomly. I mean, they were given a predetermined, you warn them, you give them a short warning, or you arrest them. So it was all randomly assigned. Hardly ever get to do that in social science. Didn't have the effect that they wanted. And there were differential effects by racial group. It was just really, really complicated, not the type of clear-cut cessation of domestic violence that people wanted. Linda Mills, my colleague at NYU, who's both a lawyer and social worker, said that mandatory arrest might just re-victimize women who don't necessarily want their husband arrested, and really what the criminal justice system should do is to empower a victim. And so the arrest by itself is not necessarily the way. Here you see the Sherman and Burke data. So the arrested group, this is a survival analysis, so high is good, they're surviving. They're not reoffending, and then suddenly around 8 months out, they do worse. So that's not the simple answer. Now, I got to just sort of say something about these. So nobody studied battered men because there were no shelters for battered men. There were no treatment groups for battered women. There was no hotline. And then finally in New Hampshire, Emily Douglas and Denise Brown, Emily Hines started this study of 302 men who called a domestic hotline for men. And this is now a domestic hotline for men. So these guys called in, and it turns out that almost 79% of them had been injured, 35% had a fairly severe injury, 58% had some signs of PTSD, And they all said, when they called the local domestic violence program for help, that 64% of them said that they were told they were the real batterer. So these guys are beat up and stressed out and told that they're the real batterer. So there is a big criminal justice problem. Now, I just quickly mentioned this study before. This is the one that Deborah Capaldi did, the Oregon Youth Survey. So she's following these couples for 10 years and assessing what's going on with violence in the couple. And at some point, for a subsample of these couples, somebody calls 911 and an arrest is made. When the arrest is made, 85% of the time, it's the male who's arrested. But she had all this prior information that went back years, and she finds that for the group where the male's arrested, 74% of these men had used prior aggression, but 87% of their female partners had used prior aggression. If you get into severe aggression, 44 and 39. In other words, the generic pattern is a mutually violent pattern that got somewhat more severe on a particular date. They called 911, they show up and arrest the man. So when people cite criminal justice statistics as telling us all we need to know about domestic violence, this is why that's not true. You know, it's a snapshot taken after the fact. It reflects police selection bias. It reflects what police have been taught to believe about domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. When you have the longer picture, as Deborah Capaldi got here, it points towards mutuality. Okay. Okay. Just let me just want to say one thing about perceptions of domestic violence. There's two, I think, really interesting studies about how we see it. Susan Sorensen in Los Angeles did this study, a random digit dial survey, 3,769 adults, and she calls them up and she reads a domestic violence scenario to them, and she varies it systematically so everything's counterbalanced. So you've got these different vignettes in which the characteristics of the victim are varied, the assailant are varied, and the incident is varied. And it's all counterbalanced, so it all comes out in the wash. So they look at, she varies things like the assailant's motive, what kind of abuse, how intense was it, whether it was alcohol involved, etc., and respondents' characteristics. And in general, for doing the same thing, women are judged less harshly. It's less harsh, and it takes contextual factors into account than if a man does it. And by the way, these are not all things like he punched her, which in theory could be worse than she punched him, but they also include psychological issues as well, like she asked him his whereabouts as opposed to he asked her whereabouts. So it's not just a physical violence thing. It's summed across a number of different dimensions. Across vignettes, male violence is seen as more likely to be illegal. Police should be called, the assailant should be arrested, should serve jail or prison time, or that a restraining order should be issued. Now, and Susan Sorensen says, important note, some of the abuse types were physical, others were psychological, involving control or humiliation. So it's not just the effect of getting punched. Now, I wish it was just the general public, but in fact, here we have psychologists, my homies, right? Here we have 449 clinicians, psychologists at median age 52, same deal. They're given these varied scenarios. Things like the gender of the perpetrator are varied, contextual factors are varied, and psychologists rate male perpetrated behaviors more abusive and severe than the wife's use of the identical actions. Identical, okay, these things are all counterbalanced experimentally. So, Fallingstad says it's this: a stereotype appears to extend to association of psychological abuse in males. Okay, I promised you 3 sensational horror stories to wind it up, to counterbalance those other 3. So here's one. Catherine Q, who drugged her husband, cut off his penis, and threw it into a garburator. Right. She said he deserved it. Apparently he deserved it because he talked about getting a divorce. When he woke up, he was tied to a bed and couldn't move. Okay, so there's that one. She has a website of Facebook followers who believe she should be set free. Okay. And there's Larissa Schuster, who dipped her husband head first into a vat of hydrochloric acid. Right. Bragged about her abusiveness to her manicurist, said, quote, "It's better than sex." Okay. The prosecution played telephone messages of her berating her husband on the phone. She first made him unconscious with a stun gun. And then there's Joyce Gregory, who squeezed her husband's testicles so strong that one of them popped out. And on her, in the Facebook, it says, "That sounds painful, but he probably did something to deserve it." I'm just putting these in to show you can pick horrific things that people from almost any group on the planet have done. But if you just focus on those horrific things, you get a really distorted view of the human condition. I wrote a book once about genocide and the human condition and wound up dedicating the book to my dog. Okay. So, by way of saying also that when we look equally at both genders, we find something a little different from the guy with the belt and the woman cowering in the background. That most IPVs bilateral. Why are we not using couples counseling? Why are we not using marital therapists? Women are hurt more often, but they're not the ones who are exclusively hurt. I mean, it's 1/6 of a standard deviation. Coercion traps are a huge issue. Why are we not teaching people more about how to deal with conflict? Even just walking away and cooling down. I mean, when we did the treatment group, we used to teach people how to do timeouts. We give them a timeout card. You know, you walk away from the situation, you calm yourself down, you make sure you're doing this. You only go back if you can remain calmed down. If not, and we had group buddies in the group, they could go spend the night with this guy if they couldn't calm down that day. And you don't go back until things have calmed down. And then, of course, we have to teach some other ways of conflict resolution. This is just a stopgap measure, but we're not even doing that. Daphne Bram's article I don't think is that unusual, but it does technically fit the criteria for propaganda. I had the great good fortune of reviewing Eileen Gambrell's book, Propaganda in the Helping Professions, for the American Psychological Association. And basically, you stretch or cherry pick the data, you mix in really extreme examples with this stretched cherry pick data to convey the impression that the extreme example is far more common than it usually is. And so typically that, Daphne Bram's column meets those criteria. The consequences extend to treatment. I won't go into this in great detail. I did cognitive behavioral treatment. I did group therapy for 15 years in Vancouver. And that basically got replaced. It got replaced by something called the Duluth model, which was a kind of psychoeducational model that what's good about it is it's cheap and you can get probation officers to do it and they don't cost as much as psychologists or someone else, but it's totally based on the functional sociological view that we started out with, this Marxist view of relationships. Here's a quote that comes from it this is what you're supposed to do to educate these guys who've been convicted of wife assault. Using slavery, a colonial relationship, or an oppressively structured workplace as an example, the facilitator can draw a picture of the consciousness of domination. So bear in mind now, half the guys in this group are going to be there with women who started the violence and are just as violent as they are. And you're now going to tell them about how they're dominating. And my favorite story was I was teaching this to the U.S. Department of Defense, This woman said, well, I can't wait to use a Duluth model. The Sergeant so-and-so, he's in my group. And as soon as he gets well from his combat injuries, I'm going to use it with him. And that didn't seem to strike her as ironic at all. I, of course, didn't see it that way. Ken Corbo and I wrote a paper where we likened the Duluth model to Korean brainwashing techniques used in the Korean War. There's one issue that you have to establish in any form of therapy with clients, and that's to form a therapeutic bond. You don't really do that by telling somebody they're the dominator when they might, in fact, not be. Okay. That's just a little bit more data. Basically, saying that the Duluth model doesn't work. Okay, it actually winds up producing higher recidivism than in untreated controls. Okay, like 4 of the 6 studies that were evaluated by this group in Washington State, the Duluth model was worse than untreated controls. So again, another vestige of the gender paradigm that just has to go. Paradigms are with us. The gender paradigm sailed through. Who was going to oppose it? I mean, the political left loved it because it was women's rights. Because once you equate intimate partner violence with the political act, then it is a women's rights issue, overlooking the fact that women might be violent too and there might be psychological causes. The political right loved it because it was a family values issue. There was no opposition. So it becomes what Kathleen Taylor, the neuropsychologist, calls an ephemeral belief, a complex constellation of beliefs, notoriously hard to change. And in fact, work on belief, perseverance, and social psychology says, if you believe the gender paradigm, nothing I've said right now will change your mind. Okay. On the other hand, there are those 249 studies that we talked about. Enough.